Devastating by the sudden death of his daughter, the father decided to watch the camera footage to see her one last time. However, he suddenly discovered something truly horrifying. Franklin sat at the edge of the bed, his prosthetic leg propped up against the nightstand, the morning sunlight catching the worn straps that had become a part of him. His fingers brushed over the medals tucked inside the bedside drawer, the weight of years spent on battlefields still heavy on his mind. He turned to Emma, who was busy powdering her face at the vanity. "Emma, do you remember what I told you that day in the hospital?" he asked softly, his voice steady but laced with an ache only she could stir. Emma's brush paused mid-stroke, but she didn't turn around. "You've told me a lot of things, Franklin. You'll have to be more specific." His lips pressed into a thin line, but he tried again. "I told you I'd build us a life, that I wouldn't let this leg define what I can give you." Emma let out a small sigh, setting the brush down as if it weighed too much. Her reflection in the mirror flicked her gaze at him for only a moment before she spoke. "And you have, haven't you? We've got the big house, the cars. You've made good on your promise." She sounded tired, and Franklin caught the faintest trace of something he couldn't name. Was it gratitude? Regret? He wanted to ask, but the words felt too fragile, too easily shattered by whatever answer might come. When Franklin returned from the war, the small town of Burnsville felt like a strange echo of the life he once knew. Friends and neighbors looked at him with a mixture of pity and reverence, their eyes always trailing down to the empty space where his leg used to be. But Franklin wasn't the type to dwell on what he'd lost. He focused on what he could build. He threw himself into real estate, starting small, buying up fixer-uppers and flipping them for a profit. It wasn't long before his reputation grew, and with it, his portfolio. The deals got bigger, the returns richer. Franklin didn't just succeed, he thrived, defying everyone's expectations, including his own. And through it all, he clung to the idea that every success, every dollar earned, would bring Emma closer to the woman he fell in love with. The one who used to laugh with him late into the night, sharing dreams about the future. He didn't notice, or perhaps refused to see, how the laughter had long since faded, replaced by polite smiles and distant eyes. Emma, for her part, had been everything a man like Franklin could have hoped for in the beginning. She was beautiful, warm, and full of life, a bright counterpoint to the shadowy weight he carried from the war. But that warmth began to cool after the accident. At first, it was subtle. She stopped holding his hand in public. Her voice carried a faint edge when she spoke to him at home. Franklin told himself it was just the strain of adjusting, of learning how to navigate the changes that came with his prosthetic leg and the stares that followed them everywhere. But as months turned into years, the truth became harder to ignore. Emma's affection grew more calculated, her smiles thinner. She kept up appearances in public, playing the doting wife at community events and social gatherings. But behind closed doors, her patience wore thin. "I don't know why you insist on trying to do everything yourself," she snapped one evening when Franklin struggled with a jammed kitchen drawer. "You've got money now, Franklin. Hire someone to fix it." Franklin winced, not at the words, but at the way they cut through the room like glass. "Emma, it's just a drawer. I'm not helpless." She didn't respond, just crossed her arms and watched him with a look he couldn't quite place. Was it frustration? Resentment? He didn't know anymore. The turning point came when Franklin closed his first multi-million-dollar deal. It was a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Burnsville, the kind of property that would cement his name in the industry. He came home that evening, excitement bubbling over as he carried a bottle of champagne through the door. "Emma, you won't believe it. The Whittaker deal. It's done. We're set for life." Emma emerged from the kitchen, her face unreadable. But when she saw the papers he held, her expression softened into something almost genuine. She stepped forward, taking the bottle from his hand. "Well, congratulations," she said, popping the cork with practiced ease. "Looks like all your hard work's paid off." Franklin beamed, not just for the deal, but for the flicker of warmth in her voice. Maybe, he thought, this was the moment they'd been waiting for. A fresh start, a reason to hope. Franklin set the empty champagne glass on the counter and leaned back in his chair, watching Emma as she moved around the kitchen with newfound energy. She hummed a tune he didn't recognize, her movements brisk and purposeful. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to believe the tension that had simmered between them for years might finally ease. Maybe this was their chance to rebuild what had been lost. But deep down, the doubt lingered. The call came 3 days later, just as Franklin was stepping out of his office. It was short, curt, and left a chill in his chest that no amount of sunlight could thaw. "Franklin, it's Jim," the voice on the other end said, heavy with exhaustion. I hate to be the one to tell you, but Paul and Margie didn't make it. There was an accident. Their little girl, she's all alone." Franklin's breath caught in his throat. Paul had been his closest friend during the war, the one who'd dragged him to safety when his leg had been torn apart by shrapnel. They'd shared laughter, tears, and promises that stretched into forever. And now? Gone. Just like that. "Jennifer," Franklin said, the name barely more than a whisper. "Yeah," Jim confirmed, his voice cracking. "She's only 2. They're talking about putting her in a home unless someone steps up." Franklin didn't need time to think. "She's not going to a home," he said firmly. "I'll take her." When Franklin told Emma about Jennifer, her reaction was swift and sharp. "Have you lost your mind?" she snapped, folding her arms tightly across her chest. "We're not taking in someone else's child, Franklin. We're barely keeping things together as it is." Franklin took a measured breath, his prosthetic leg aching faintly as he shifted his weight. "She's not just someone else's child, Emma. She's Paul's daughter. You remember Paul, don't you? He saved my life. The least I can do is make sure his little girl has a home." Emma's lips thinned into a line, her expression hardening. "And what about us? What about me? You've got your hands full with work. Who's going to take care of her? Cook for her? Clean up after her?" "I didn't sign up to be anyone's nanny." "She's 2 years old, Emma," Franklin said, his voice low but resolute. "She just lost her parents. She doesn't need a nanny. She needs a family. She needs us." Emma threw up her hands in exasperation. "Don't guilt-trip me, Franklin. I'm not heartless, but this isn't realistic. You're not thinking this through." Franklin's jaw tightened. "I've thought it through, and I'm not changing my mind." Jennifer arrived 2 weeks later, clutching a faded teddy bear in one tiny hand. Her wide eyes, framed by soft curls, darted nervously between Franklin and Emma as she was led into the house. Franklin knelt down, wincing slightly as his knee creaked, and offered her a warm smile. "Hey there, Jennifer," he said gently. "I'm Franklin, but you can call me Uncle Frank if you want. And this," he gestured toward Emma, who stood stiffly by the doorway, "is Aunt Emma. We're really happy you're here." Jennifer blinked up at him, her grip on the teddy bear tightening. She didn't speak, but she stepped a little closer, her small fingers brushing against his sleeve. Franklin felt his chest tighten. not with grief, but with something deeper, something that felt a lot like purpose. Emma didn't say much that first night. She set a plate of spaghetti in front of Jennifer, barely glancing at the little girl as she murmured, "Eat up." Jennifer hesitated, her gaze flicking nervously to Franklin, who nodded reassuringly. Only then did she pick up her fork. Over the weeks that followed, Jennifer's presence seemed to breathe new life into the house. Her laughter echoed through the hallways, her small footsteps pattered on the hardwood floors as she explored her new home. Franklin found himself smiling more often, drawn to her innocence and curiosity. He taught her how to tie her shoes, read her bedtime stories, and held her close when she woke up crying for her parents. "It's okay, sweetheart," he'd whisper, stroking her hair as she sobbed into his chest. "You're safe now. I've got you." But for every moment of joy Jennifer brought him, there was an equal measure of tension with Emma. She grew increasingly distant, her smiles becoming fewer and far between. When Franklin was around, she made a point of being polite to Jennifer, even affectionate at times. But as soon as his back was turned, her indifference returned. One afternoon, Franklin came home early from a meeting to find Jennifer sitting alone on the living room floor, her teddy bear clutched tightly to her chest. Her cheeks were streaked with tears. "What's wrong, sweetie?" he asked, kneeling beside her. Jennifer sniffled, her voice barely audible. "Aunt Emma. She said I shouldn't bother her anymore." Franklin felt his stomach knot. He stood and found Emma in the kitchen, calmly chopping vegetables as if nothing had happened. "What the hell did you say to her?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. Emma didn't look up. "I told her the truth," she said coolly. "She can't expect me to drop everything for her every time she wants attention. You're the one who wanted her here, Franklin, not me." Franklin stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in like stones. He didn't reply, didn't trust himself to speak without shouting. Instead, he turned and went back to Jennifer, silently vowing to shield her from the growing storm inside his home. Franklin sat in the dim light of the living room that night, staring at the soft glow of Jennifer's nightlight spilling under her door. The quiet hum of the house felt too loud against the weight in his chest. He'd always known Emma wasn't thrilled about Jennifer moving in. But tonight, her coldness wasn't just unsettling. It was undeniable. Still, a part of him clung to hope. People could change, couldn't they? Maybe Emma just needed time to adjust. After all, taking in a child wasn't a small decision, and Franklin had made it without much discussion. He leaned back in his chair, fingers threading through his hair, as doubt crept in like a shadow. The next morning, Emma was different. She greeted Jennifer with a smile that seemed almost genuine, her tone uncharacteristically soft. "Good morning, sweetheart," Emma said, setting a plate of scrambled eggs in front of the little girl. Jennifer looked up at Franklin, uncertain, before mumbling a quiet "thank you" to Emma. Franklin's heart lifted slightly. Maybe they'd turned a corner. Maybe the storm that had been brewing for weeks was finally passing. Over the next few days, Emma seemed to take an active interest in Jennifer. She began helping her with little things, tying her shoes, brushing her hair. She even bought Jennifer a new dress, presenting it with a warmth that made Franklin's chest tighten with cautious relief. "You see?" Emma said one evening, sitting beside Franklin on the couch while Jennifer played with her teddy bear on the floor. "I told you I'd come around. She's a sweet kid, really. I think I was just overwhelmed before." Franklin smiled, his hand resting lightly on hers. "I knew you'd see it. Thank you, Emma, for giving her a chance." Emma tilted her head, her lips curving into a faint smile. "She deserves it." For a time, Franklin allowed himself to believe things were getting better. Jennifer seemed happier, her laughter filling the house as she and Emma spent time together. But there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when Jennifer's joy faltered. One evening, Franklin walked into the living room to find Jennifer sitting on the rug, her teddy bear cradled tightly in her arms. She looked up at him, her small face unusually pale. "What's wrong, Pumpkin?" Franklin asked, kneeling beside her. Jennifer's eyes darted toward the kitchen where Emma was rinsing dishes. She whispered, "I'm okay, Uncle Frank." Franklin frowned. "Are you sure? You can tell me anything." Jennifer hesitated, then nodded. But the way she held her bear, clutching it like a shield, left a nagging unease in the back of Franklin's mind. The cracks in Emma's act became harder to ignore as the weeks passed. She was careful, always putting on a show of kindness when Franklin was around. But when she thought no one was watching, her mask slipped. Jennifer began avoiding Emma, her playful demeanor vanishing whenever the two were alone. She stuck close to Franklin, her tiny hand gripping his, whenever Emma entered the room. One afternoon, Franklin overheard a quiet exchange between them. "I told you to put your toys away." Emma's voice was sharp, the kind she used when Franklin wasn't home. "I'm sorry, Aunt Emma," Jennifer said softly, her voice trembling. "Sorry doesn't clean up the mess, does it?" Franklin stepped into the room before Emma could say anything else. "What's going on here?" he asked, keeping his tone steady. Emma turned, her face instantly softening. "Oh, nothing," she said breezily. "Jennifer just forgot to pick up after herself. I was giving her a little nudge." Jennifer looked at Franklin, her eyes wide but silent. He crouched beside her, brushing a hand over her hair. "It's okay, kiddo," he said gently. "Why don't you go play in the yard for a bit?" Jennifer nodded and hurried out the door, her teddy bear clutched tightly in her arms. Franklin turned to Emma. "You don't have to be so hard on her," he said, his voice firm but calm. Emma's smile faltered. "I'm not being hard on her, Franklin. I'm just teaching her to be responsible. Someone has to." Franklin stared at her for a long moment, his stomach twisting. There was something in her tone, something colder than he wanted to admit. Jennifer's third birthday came on a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where the sunlight seemed to melt into the golden leaves scattered across the yard. Franklin had spent the week preparing, eager to give the little girl a celebration she'd never forget. He hung streamers in the living room and baked a lopsided cake, refusing Emma's half-hearted offers to help. He wanted this day to be perfect. Jennifer's eyes widened as she unwrapped her final gift, a doll with shiny hair and a pale porcelain face, her dress embroidered with tiny roses. "It's special," Franklin said, kneeling beside her. "See? This little camera right here in her eye. It takes pictures. Now we can save all your adventures together." Jennifer hugged the doll tightly, a giggle bubbling from her lips. "Thank you, Uncle Frank." Emma watched from the doorway, her smile small and tight. "It's quite the gift," she said, her tone clipped. Franklin glanced at her, catching the faint edge in her voice. But Jennifer's laughter drowned it out, and for a moment, everything felt right. Over the next year, Jennifer carried the doll everywhere. She named it Rosie, cradled it at night, and whispered secrets to it during quiet afternoons. Franklin often found her sprawled on the rug, Rosie perched in her lap as Jennifer narrated fantastical tales about princesses and faraway kingdoms. But while Jennifer's world grew brighter, the tension between Franklin and Emma thickened. Emma's smiles became harder to find, her affection for Jennifer as fleeting as the sunlight in a storm. And then, one cold evening in late winter, everything fell apart. The call came from Jennifer's preschool. "Mr. Franklin, Jennifer collapsed during story time," the voice on the other end said, frantic and sharp. "We called an ambulance, but you need to meet us at the hospital." Franklin's heart clenched as he sped through the streets, Emma silent beside him in the passenger seat. She didn't speak, didn't even look at him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When they arrived, a doctor met them in the sterile, too-bright hallway. His face was grave, his words clipped and clinical. "I'm sorry." Her heart stopped. "We did everything we could." Franklin's knees buckled and Emma's hand shot out to steady him. For the first time in years, she looked at him with something that resembled real emotion. "She's gone," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. But Franklin barely heard her. His mind was stuck on Jennifer's laughter, on the way she'd hugged Rosie that morning before he left for work. Gone? It didn't seem possible. The funeral came too soon, rushed and uncomfortably quiet. Emma insisted on immediate arrangements, brushing aside Franklin's pleas to wait for an autopsy. "What's the point?" she said, her voice firm but brittle. "She's gone, Franklin. Nothing will bring her back. Let her rest." Franklin, drowning in his grief, relented. He didn't have the strength to argue. Jennifer was buried in a small plot near the edge of town, Rosie tucked in her tiny arms. That night, Franklin sat alone in the darkened living room, staring at the blank television screen. Sleep felt impossible, his mind replaying every memory of Jennifer, the way she laughed, the way she'd run to him when she was scared. And then he remembered the camera, Rosie's camera. His hands trembled as he grabbed his phone and opened the app the toy store clerk had helped him install months ago. The screen lit up, and for a moment all he could see was darkness. But then the playback began. At first the footage was mundane, Jennifer's small hands adjusting Rosie's dress, her wide smile filling the frame as she played on the floor. Franklin's voice occasionally drifting in from another room, warm and steady. But, as the timeline neared its end, the images changed. Franklin's breath caught as he saw Emma's face fill the screen. She wasn't smiling. The video showed Emma in Jennifer's room, holding a small bottle in one hand. Her voice, calm and low, filtered through the speakers. "This'll help you sleep, sweetie," she said. Jennifer's tiny voice replied, soft and uncertain. "But I'm not sleepy." "Just a little," Emma said, her tone sweet but firm. "Be a good girl for me, okay?" The screen showed Emma tipping the bottle into a cup, her movements quick and practiced. Jennifer's small hand reached for it hesitantly, and then the screen went dark. Franklin sat frozen, his phone trembling in his hands. He replayed the footage again, as if staring at the screen long enough might make it change. But it didn't. There was Emma, leaning over Jennifer with a sweetness that twisted into something dark, her hands steady as she poured the contents of the bottle into the cup. Jennifer's small voice echoed faintly in his ears. "But I'm not sleepy." Franklin's breath came in shallow gasps. His mind swirled with disbelief and rage, each emotion crashing into the next. His wife, his Emma, had done this. She had looked into the trusting eyes of a little girl and betrayed her in the worst way possible. He didn't know how long he sat there, the sun rising and spilling pale light across the living room. But when he finally moved, it was with a sudden, urgent purpose. The drive to the cemetery was a blur, the roads stretching endlessly as Franklin gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make his knuckles ache. His thoughts raced faster than the car. What if he was too late? What if Jennifer— No, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head fiercely. He couldn't think that way. Not now. When he reached the small cemetery, the air was cold, biting against his skin as he stumbled out of the car. The shovel he'd grabbed from the garage felt heavy in his hands, but his resolve was heavier. His heart pounded as he approached the fresh mound of dirt where Jennifer had been laid to rest just days before. He hesitated, staring at the grave marker with her name etched into it. For a moment, guilt and doubt washed over him. This was insane, wasn't it? Digging up a grave? But the image of Jennifer's small, fragile frame on that video pushed him forward. The first strike of the shovel into the frozen earth was the hardest. The sound of metal against dirt rang out in the stillness, each motion fueled by desperation. Franklin's hands burned, his arms ached, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Sweat dripped down his face, mixing with the cold air as he finally reached the top of the wooden coffin. His breath came in ragged bursts as he knelt down, his fingers brushing over the edges. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please let me be wrong." With a deep breath, he pried open the lid. Inside, Jennifer lay motionless, Rosie still clutched in her arms. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. But then a faint, shallow breath escaped her. It was so weak, Franklin almost missed it. "Oh my God," he choked out, tears streaming down his face. He reached in, gently pulling her into his arms. "I've got you, baby girl. I've got you." The hospital was a flurry of activity when Franklin burst through the emergency room doors, Jennifer limp against his chest. Nurses and doctors swarmed around him, their questions a blur as he stumbled to explain. "She's alive," he kept repeating. "She's alive. You have to help her." They whisked Jennifer away, leaving Franklin standing in the stark, fluorescent-lit hallway. His chest felt hollow, his hands trembling as he stared after her. A nurse approached him hours later, her face a careful mask of professionalism. "She's stable," she said gently, "but her condition is critical. The sedative in her system was nearly fatal. She's lucky you brought her in when you did." Franklin nodded, swallowing hard. "Can I see her?" The nurse hesitated, then motioned for him to follow. Jennifer looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, her tiny frame dwarfed by the machines and tubes surrounding her. Franklin pulled a chair close, his hands trembling as he brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have protected you. I should have known." Jennifer's eyelids fluttered faintly, but she didn't wake. Franklin stayed by her side all night, his thoughts a chaotic mix of relief and anger. He couldn't stop replaying the footage in his mind, Emma's calm, calculated actions. The woman he had once loved was gone. Whatever had taken her place was something else entirely. Franklin parked the car in the driveway, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Jennifer sat in the back seat, bundled in her favorite blanket from the hospital. She was still weak, her breathing shallow but steady. He turned to her, his voice softening despite the storm brewing inside him. "Pumpkin, we're home now," he said gently. "You'll rest upstairs in your room, okay? Don't worry about anything else." Jennifer gave a faint nod, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Franklin scooped her up in his arms, her weight light against him as he carried her inside. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, when he stepped through the front door. Emma's absence wasn't surprising. She rarely greeted him anymore, but tonight It felt ominous. He placed Jennifer carefully on her bed, brushing a hand over her damp forehead. "I'll be right here if you need me," he whispered, but his gaze lingered on the door. Emma was in the kitchen when Franklin found her, a glass of wine in hand and a book open on the counter. She looked up as he entered, her expression shifting quickly from mild irritation to feigned delight. "You're back!" she exclaimed, setting the glass down and stepping toward him. "How's Jennifer? Is she—" Her voice trailed off as she took in Franklin's face. There was no warmth in his eyes, no hesitation in the way he stared at her. "She's alive," Franklin said flatly, holding her gaze. Emma's mouth fell open slightly, and for a moment she looked genuinely shocked. "What? How? Don't!" Franklin cut her off, his voice low and sharp. "Don't play dumb, Emma. Not now." Emma froze, her hand hovering over the back of a chair. "I don't understand. Franklin, what are you talking about?" Franklin reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen, the video beginning to play, Emma's image filling the small frame. He stepped closer, holding it up for her to see. "This," he said coldly, "this is what I'm talking about." Emma's face drained of color as she watched herself on the screen. Her hand shot to her mouth, but her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape she couldn't find. "I can explain," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Explain." Franklin's voice rose, anger breaking through his usual calm. "You drugged her, Emma. You stood there and gave her enough to knock her out, enough to almost kill her." "I didn't mean to," Emma cried, her voice cracking. "I wasn't trying to hurt her, Franklin. I just wanted her to sleep. She was always crying, always clinging to you. I thought if she just rested—" "Stop!" Franklin barked, slamming the phone onto the counter. "Do you even hear yourself? You wanted her to sleep? So what? You poured enough sedative to put a grown man under into her cup. And then what, Emma? You rushed to bury her before anyone could figure out what you'd done?" Emma shook her head wildly, tears streaming down her face. "No, I didn't know it would go that far. I panicked, Franklin. I swear. I thought she was dead," Franklin finished for her, his voice cold. "You thought she was dead, so you buried her. And if that's true, if you didn't mean for this to happen, why didn't you call for help? Why didn't you tell me?" Emma collapsed into a chair, her sobs echoing in the kitchen. "I was scared," she whispered. "I was scared you'd hate me, that you'd leave me." Franklin stared at her, his chest heaving. For years, he had tried to ignore the distance between them, the growing emptiness in their marriage. But now, all those cracks were laid bare, too deep to ever mend. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice laced with finality. "I do hate you, and I am leaving you, but not before you leave this house." Emma's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face twisted in disbelief. "Franklin, please don't do this. We can fix this." "There's no fixing this," Franklin interrupted, his tone firm. "You've done enough. Jennifer nearly died because of you. I'll never forgive you for that." He reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a set of documents. He placed them on the counter between them. "This is a divorce agreement," he said. "I've been holding on to it for years, hoping I'd never have to use it. But now there's no choice. Sign it, pack your things, and get out." Emma's hands trembled as she picked up the papers, her eyes scanning the words through blurry tears. "You're really doing this?" she whispered, her voice hollow. Franklin nodded, his expression unyielding. "I've already called my lawyer, and if you don't leave willingly, I'll take this video to the police. Believe me, Emma, they'll be very interested in what you've done." Her sobs grew louder as she realized the weight of his words. She stood slowly, the papers clutched against her chest. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I never meant for it to go this far." Franklin didn't respond. He turned his back on her, his shoulders stiff as he walked out of the kitchen. Franklin watched through the front window as Emma's car disappeared down the road. The faint rumble of the engine faded into silence, leaving the house still and heavy. He stood there for a long moment, his hand resting against the cool glass. It was over, he thought. The lies, the pretense, the poisonous weight she had brought into their lives. It was all over. But the quiet wasn't the relief Franklin had hoped for. Instead, it felt sharp-edged, cutting into the spaces where anger and heartbreak had been. He turned away from the window and walked down the hall to Jennifer's room. She was still asleep, her tiny face peaceful against the pillow. Her favorite doll, Rosie, was tucked under her arm, its plastic eye gleaming faintly in the dim light. Franklin sat at the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under his weight. He reached out, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "You're safe now," he whispered down, though the words felt like a promise he was only beginning to understand. The days that followed were a blur of cleaning, sorting, and selling. Franklin moved through the house like a man on a mission, determined to erase every trace of Emma's presence. Her clothes were packed into bags and donated. The furniture she'd insisted on buying, ornate pieces that never felt like home, was sold off to the highest bidder. Each item that left the house felt like a small victory, a reclaiming of the space they'd shared. But it was the photos that hurt the most, smiling faces frozen in time, capturing a happiness that now felt like a cruel joke. Franklin gathered them all into a box and shoved it into the back of the attic. He couldn't bring himself to throw them away, but he didn't want them in the house either. Jennifer's recovery became Franklin's sole focus. He spent hours by her side, reading her favorite books, coaxing her to eat small bites of the soups he made, and holding her hand when nightmares broke her fragile sleep. "Uncle Frank," she whispered one night, her voice barely audible over the hum of the heater. "Are you mad at me?" Franklin's chest tightened, and he leaned closer, his hand covering hers. "Mad at you? Sweetheart, why would you think that?" Jennifer hesitated, her eyes welling with tears. "Because I made everything so hard. For you, and for Aunt Emma." Franklin's heart broke all over again. He gathered her into his arms, holding her close. "Listen to me, Pumpkin," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "None of this is your fault, not one bit. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, and don't you ever forget it." Jennifer nodded against his chest, her small arms wrapping around him tightly. Franklin held her until her breathing slowed, his resolve hardening with every passing moment. The house grew quieter as the weeks passed, but it wasn't the uneasy silence of before. It was a peaceful quiet, filled with the soft patter of Jennifer's footsteps as she regained her strength, the rustle of pages as Franklin read her bedtime stories, and the faint hum of life slowly being rebuilt. Franklin sold the house not long after. It held too many memories, too many shadows. He bought a modest place on the edge of town, a little fixer-upper with a yard big enough for Jennifer to play in when she was ready. He poured himself into making it a home, painting walls, fixing leaky faucets, and building a swing set in the backyard. Jennifer loved watching him work, her laughter ringing out whenever he paused to show her how something worked. "You're going to be my little helper," he said one afternoon, handing her a paintbrush. Jennifer giggled, the sound like sunlight breaking through a storm. Emma, meanwhile, drifted into a solitude of her own making. She moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, far from the life she had once shared with Franklin. At first, she tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, attending social gatherings and forcing smiles when acquaintances asked about her marriage. But the questions became harder to dodge, the whispers harder to ignore. What happened to Franklin? Where's Jennifer? Why did they leave so suddenly? The weight of their curiosity, paired with the truth Emma carried, began to crush her. Nights stretched into endless hours of silence, broken only by the echoes of her own guilt. Emma started drinking more, her once polished image slipping away, piece by piece. The friends she had once impressed grew distant, their pity masked by polite avoidance. Her career faltered, deals fell through, clients stopped calling. The wealth she had clung to as a lifeline drained away, leaving her with nothing but memories she wished she could escape. She thought about Franklin often, though the memories were always tinged with regret. She thought about the way he used to look at her, the quiet kindness in his eyes before everything fell apart. And she thought about Jennifer, the little girl she had failed in the worst way possible. Some nights she dreamed of knocking on Franklin's door, begging for forgiveness, but she never found the courage. The story of Franklin and Jennifer is a poignant journey of resilience, redemption, and the enduring power of love. Franklin's transformation from a broken man, haunted by betrayal and loss, into a devoted father symbolizes the triumph of compassion over despair. His unwavering dedication to Jennifer, even in the face of immense personal pain, highlights the strength that can be found in protecting and nurturing others. Jennifer's growth from a vulnerable, hurt child into a happy and confident individual is equally inspiring. Her resilience, shaped by Franklin's unconditional love, serves as a reminder of how kindness and stability can heal even the deepest wounds. Their relationship is a testament to the importance of family, not defined by blood, but by the care and support we provide one another. Emma's downfall, on the other hand, underscores the devastating consequences of selfishness and betrayal. Her isolation and regret offer a stark contrast to Franklin's hope-filled future, emphasizing the value of integrity and empathy. The story teaches us a profound lesson. No matter how dark the past may seem, there is always a chance for renewal through courage, love, and selflessness. It reminds us that true happiness lies in creating a positive impact on the lives of others. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.